Welcome to another episode of Electable. I'm Deb Chubb, and today we are going to be talking about the new silver bullet to come to our land called hydrogen. And so we are very fortunate to have Kerwin Olson, Executive Director of Citizens Action Coalition here in Indiana, help us figure this out and understand it. We've all heard about hydrogen. This is it. It's the clean burning fuel that we need to run everything from our cars to steel mills to electricity production. So that's great, but the question then becomes, well, where do we get the hydrogen and how do we get it? And I think many places in Indiana are ready to run toward this, promised land of hydrogen. And I certainly feel like I need to know a little bit more information about it. So we know hydrogen, generally the way to produce it is to break it out of water. But again, how do we do that? And what are the side effects of that process? And so there are several different ideas going around. So I'm so grateful to have you here, Kerwin, to help us through this complicated process. So have I screwed anything up so far? Is it true? we take hydrogen out of water. That's how we get it generally, right?
Yes, and as you said, hydrogen has become the sort of magical unicorn, the silver bullet. It sort of is the response to everything about, 20, 30, 40 years down the road, well, everything's going to be hydrogen. But there is so much more to that conversation. We are, just now starting to understand and learn about hydrogen because this train is moving so fast. But there's so many things to talk about when it comes to hydrogen energy in general that often goes unsaid. First, with hydrogen, it matters what you make the hydrogen with, where you generate the hydrogen. We have all of the various colors of hydrogen: blue, green, gray, brown hydrogen, that are tied to how that hydrogen is produced. And so environmentalists and advocates like Citizens Action Coalition are, generally supportive of the idea of green hydrogen. That is hydrogen that is made from renewable energy, from wind, from hydro, from solar, no carbon emissions, no additional pollutants.
Okay, let me just stop you there for a second.
Sure.
So what you're saying is that you're going to use clean energy production, like solar, wind, etc., to split the water and create the hydrogen, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Solar, wind, hydro, correct. But there are also, especially in Indiana, Illinois, the momentum is on the side of what is called blue or pink hydrogen. Pink hydrogen would be hydrogen made from nuclear reactors, and blue hydrogen would be hydrogen made from fossil gas, methane, with then the resulting carbon emissions from that being captured and stored underground. And then we also have brown and black hydrogen, where the hydrogen could be made from coal, could be made from petroleum coke or pet coke, as they're talking about down in West Terre Haute. So the first thing to sort of understand about hydrogen is, how are we making that hydrogen? There's a big difference between making hydrogen with solar panels and wind turbines and making hydrogen with methane, nuclear power, or pet coke or coal. Very, very different processes, very, very different environmental footprint, and very, very different impact on public health and the future of energy. And the other part of the hydrogen conversation that we need to figure out is, what are the end uses for that hydrogen? Because when you talk to folks about energy, about transportation, everything by 2040, by 2050 is going to be hydrogen. We're going to be making steel, powering our steel mills, running our airplanes, running our cars, running our trucks, making electricity. So I think from CAC's perspective, it's a matter of also making a determination about what is the right end use for that hydrogen, because CAC, again, maintains our position that when it comes to electricity, we can do a lot with conservation, a lot with energy efficiency, and a whole lot with rooftop solar and renewable energy. So do we really need hydrogen to be a major player, for example, when it comes to the generation of electricity? It appears to us, just in some of our early work, that perhaps the best use for hydrogen at this point in time might be end-use industrial processes that are very, very hard to decarbonize, require a lot of heat for those processes, a lot of energy. And then there's also appears to be potentially a role in long haul trucking, potentially aviation, tugboats, mariner vehicles, those type of things. But let's not get too carried away with the idea that we're going to have a 100% hydrogen future, come 2040, come 2050, because that's a lot of hydrogen. We don't know a lot about using hydrogen at that scale. It's odorless. You can't see it. You can't smell it. You can't taste it. The more I'm learning about, not a chemist, but the more I learn about hydrogen, there's some risks, to a hydrogen economy that we need to sort of better understand. But getting back to the first point is CAC believes that there is definitely a role for hydrogen, but we believe that hydrogen should be green, made from renewable energy, and hydrogen production should not be an additional source of CO2 emissions that we then have to deal with, especially with carbon capture and sequestration, which CAC is not at all supportive of.
Great. So excellent. Thank you very much. That was so helpful. So now I want to talk about, well, we can talk a little bit more about, about the problems with hydrogen production. But I want to talk to, like we said earlier, what happens when hydrogen comes to your town? Because we have apparently at the state level and at the federal level, a lot of incentive for people to get into the hydrogen production business. And the carbon capture and sequestration has been kind of the big part of this conversation, at least in Indiana, because our legislature has been really accommodating people who want to kind of experiment with hydrogen production and specifically the carbon capture and sequestration of the CO2s. That right? Am I saying that right? That are produced and making that production. They want to say that solves the problem of the other terrible emissions, the carbon emissions that are produced when you're producing hydrogen. So we want to, in Indiana, at least on a few of these cases, people are getting all kinds of tax breaks and other grants to support producing hydrogen and using old-fashioned methods to do it that produce carbon, and but then capturing that carbon, so it's not going out into the air. That we're theoretically capturing it. I get like all quivery when I think about the notion that we're just gonna inject it into the ground and then it will be fine. That just to me that just seems a little crazy. But anyway, so this is what we're going to really get into here, because this is what's happening in Indiana now that's really causing some controversy. And I know that CIC has been involved helping people speak out and really figure this out. I saw that legislation go through and I was like, what is it? What? And then it was done. And what was it? So there was legislation passed over the last couple of years that really encouraged this kind of carbon capture and sequestration, underground sequestration of carbon emissions. And then this last year, there was another bill that moved the liability for any bad impacts of that, from the industrial producer of the carbon emissions that are going to be sequestered to people who own the property over which the carbon is injected. So tell us what's happening in Vigo and Vermilion counties there. It's the industry is Wabash. What is it? Oh, now I keep forgetting.
Wabash Valley Resources.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Generic names. Wabash Valley Resources. Okay, yeah. So tell us what's happening there.
Yeah, well, just quickly, the conversation at the Indiana General Assembly down at the state capitol has not been directly about hydrogen. It's been all about carbon capture and storage. And that has largely been connected in part to the hydrogen conversation. What we have going on in Vigo and Vermilion County is a project that originally was announced, really in 2016, but really took off in 2019. It's a project by a company known as Wabash Valley Resources. where in 2016 they purchased the old Duke Energy, PSI Energy gasification facility out there in West Terre Haute in 2016. And then in 2019, they came before the Indiana General Assembly with the idea of repurposing, at that time, the coal gasification unit to produce ammonia fertilizer from that gasification unit, and then capture the carbon emissions and sequester those carbon emissions underground. The next year, that project morphed into becoming a hydrogen project when all of that hydrogen money became available from the federal government. And so now at this point in time, they are intending to produce hydrogen from the gasification facility, capture the CO2 from the flue gas, allegedly permanently sequester the CO2 emissions underground in Vigo and Vermilion County, and use that hydrogen to make ammonia fertilizer for sale within the Illinois basin around that plant. Although they have indicated they could also sell that hydrogen directly to hydrogen off-takers. They said at a meeting the other day they could use that hydrogen to make electricity, to sell that electricity onto the grid. So it's still a little sketchy as far as ultimately what their business plan is, as is usually the case with a lot of these entrepreneurs, that go around knocking on doors and have great ideas. But the reality is they're getting a lot of federal support right now under a hydrogen grant, but they need to move forward with some additional paperwork to receive a huge federal loan guarantee because they don't have the equity to do everything they need to do with the plant related to the pipeline. So bottom line is that they have a project where they are intending to make hydrogen from that gasifier, use that hydrogen to make some combination of ammonia fertilizer, electricity, or potentially sell that hydrogen to an off-taker, and then build a 12 mile pipeline through Vigo and Vermilion County to sequester that carbon underground, one injection site in Vigo County, one injection site in Vermilion County. And boy, I'll tell you, Deb, the community there is up in arms as soon as they sort of learned about this thing and learned about what was going on. They're organizing. They're making some noise, and sadly, the General Assembly really tied their hands because there was two bills, special legislation passed specifically for this project and this project alone. And also specific only to Vigo and Vermilion counties. So Wabash Valley Resources, thanks to the Indiana General Assembly, get to play by a different set of rules than anybody else in Indiana who would want to do CO2 pipelines along with CO2 storage wells. So they got special legislation just for them. Not sure where the powers that be up high, who influenced all of this, but
who got the money?
It was really, really extraordinary. They kept coming back after their initial bill in 2019, kept beating them back in 2020, 21, 22. But last year, somehow they got broad bipartisan support for the special legislation that effectively allows them to condemn private property only in Vigo and Vermilion County for purposes of sequestering their CO2, pay a pittance, for that sequestered CO2. And that's unique only to Vigo and Vermilion County, as well as creating what effectively is pretty broad immunity for the investors by shifting, the burden of proof to prove harm to any animal, human, or tangible property. The burden of proof, if you will, falls on the property owner to prove that any harm was caused by the project. They would have to prove that, not the company.
So, and when you say condemn, so is property condemned because there's going to be a pipeline going under it? Like when you say condemn, I assume you mean you take it by eminent domain, and I think that was part of the legislation, right? That they determined that this was in the public good, this whole pipeline and sequestration business, so that they could then condemn property. So tell me, like, what actually is condemned?
Well, there's two parts. Well, there's really three parts to a CCS project. First of all, you need a point source for CO2. So when you hear about a CO2 pipeline project, you have to sort of try to go back to the beginning of the maze and say, okay, where's the CO2 coming from? Then they have to build pipelines. Excuse me, eminent domain for carbon dioxide transmission pipelines was actually passed by the General Assembly back in 2011. That was back in the days of the proposed, you might even remember this, the proposed Leucadia Indiana gasification substitute natural gas plant that a lot of us fought for 5 or 6 years. Never happened, was a crazy idea, but because of that, they had a CCS component. So in 2011, as part of Senate Enrolled Act 251, the General Assembly granted eminent domain for pipelines. So they have that. They have eminent domain should they choose to use it for a carbon dioxide pipeline. When I said condemn, we're talking about the last part of that, and that is the injection wells, if you will, the point at where they inject the pressurized CO2 underground. And when I say condemn, under the rules that everybody else other than Wabash Valley Resources have to play by in order to condemn property, if you will, or use private property for purposes of that storage well, the law would require that 70% consent of property owners is received prior to injecting that CO2 with the bill specific to Wabash Valley Resources, specific to Vigo and Vermilion County. They can inject supercritical, highly pressurized CO2 underground prior to notifying potentially affected landowners. And this is where it gets a little bit confusing, because when you're talking about pipelines are easy to understand. You have a pipeline, you know what's going through it, you know where it is. We don't know a whole lot about the underground sequestration of CO2. And what we don't know is how far will that underground plume migrate over time. You continually inject pressurized CO2 underground, 4,000 to 6,000 feet or so underground, about a mile. There's voids, there's lots of pore space, there's stuff in that pore space. The pressurized CO2 sort of moves through that pore space. How far over time is that CO2 going to migrate, either up, down, or vertically? There was a meeting.
So you're saying there's a point where it gets pumped in, and there's this 11 to 12 mile pipe where to move it, and then the pipe just ends. And the
pipe ends at the injection site. They inject it. No, the pipe goes to the injection site. The pipes connect whatever the source of the CO2 is, whether that's a power plant or a steel mill or an ethanol plant. CO2 is captured somewhere, captured and pressurized somewhere, put into a pipeline, and then delivered to an injection site where it's injected underground. And the fate of that plume over time is what we simply don't understand. It was suggested at one of the meetings, for example, they have basically a 2 square mile area, what they're calling the area of review. But if you look at research and modeling and studies and analysis of CO2, we know that CO2 is going to move a lot farther than 2 miles. Matter of fact, there's studies out there that suggest it may forever move potentially up to 100 miles. And so at one of the meetings, one of the local residents asked, I've read studies where it says this stuff could move 100 miles. Is that true? And Wabash Valley Resources said yes. So when I say condemned, it's a matter of using the pore space underneath your property to store that supercritical CO2. And so how far will that travel over time, and whose property are they using? And I don't think we have any idea yet until we have, some long-term data that shows the migration patterns of these plumes, which of course will differ based on the geology of each specific area. So I'm not talking about condemning property for the purposes of building a pipeline, talking about condemning property for the purposes of storing supercritical CO2 in the spore space underneath your home, your business, your school, your farm, whatever the case may be. And when you talk about a CO2 plume that's gonna move miles, you're talking about all of those things. You're going to be underneath farmland. You're going to be underneath private homes and residences and subdivisions and schools and businesses and other things.
And aquifers, right?
Oh, there's enormous risk and concern over contamination of underground sources of drinking water, underground aquifers, migrating in, creating carbonic acid, acidifying those wells, poisoning those wells. There's significant concern over seismic activity. That's
Right.
to me, that's one of the biggest concerns about this Wabash Valley Resources Project is that area sits in the Wabash Valley seismic zone. There's risks for earthquakes out in Terre Haute and the surrounding areas. And the idea that we are going to inject supercritical, highly pressurized carbon dioxide into a known seismic zone, especially when we understand that we know in Oklahoma, for example, the U.S. Geological Survey has acknowledged that there has been increased seismic activity and earthquake activity because of the underground injection of waste fluids from hydrofracking. So why is it a good idea, to inject this stuff into a seismic zone? And there's a smaller, one of the first CCS projects in the country with over cross-state borders in Illinois and Decatur, Illinois, and Archer Daniel Midland's project where they sequestered about 600,000 tons of CO2. And if you read the reports and the analysis of that project, U.S. Geological Survey identified over 4,700 what are called microquakes, not quite large enough to rise to the level of an earthquake, but almost 5,000 microquakes were recorded in that area by the sequestration of supercritical CO2. So we just think it's a little insane to be injecting this highly pressurized stuff not only into a seismic zone, but also to an area, the Wabash watershed, that serves the majority of Indiana counties. There's underground sources of drinking water. Indiana American Water has storage wells in that area and other aquifers they use. And this is where we want to inject this supercritical CO2 and risk, harm to human, animals, and property in our water, seismic risk. And then there's also significant concerns about asphyxiation from CO2, that it's heavier than oxygen. We all know this displaces oxygen. And there's abandoned mine shafts out there, abandoned mines, oil wells, gas wells. Could this stuff migrate, leak through those mine shafts to the surface, cause harm? So there's serious concerns and worries out there.
Right. So so the CO2s, as you said, are heavier than air. So let's say, it's migrating and it, finds a crack in the stone and ends up going into an old full mining shaft that's abandoned. And now it's just coming out into the atmosphere.
Right.
So then it comes out and it just sits there.
It generally forms what we've seen, it forms a blanket. And if you look at what happened in the Cameroon, Lake Nyos, where it killed thousands of head of cattle when CO2 migrated to the surface in an old lake. There was a pipeline rupture down in Mississippi, a well publicized. It's all over the place right now in Yazoo County, Mississippi, Sarkeesian, Mississippi, where a Denbury CO2 pipeline ruptured, and 45 people or so were sent to the hospital. The police chief said it looked like a zombie movie. People were passing out, asphyxiation, foaming at the mouth. Car engines stopped working because internal combustion engines require oxygen. Emergency vehicles couldn't get through. Cars and trucks couldn't run. So there's an example right here in the United States of a pipeline rupture that caused significant harm and concern down in Mississippi. So that's being well traveled right now because of this CO2 pipeline conversation that's occurring throughout the Midwest right now.
Because here we're talking about this 11 to 12 mile pipeline that would go to the injection site.
Right.
And so, do people know where the pipeline's going? And how is that? Do we know how the pipeline ruptured in Mississippi?
I haven't read the full report about the incident. The bottom line is it did rupture. Pipeline accidents have and will continue to occur. Pipeline ruptures happen. Things break. Yes, there's a map for the proposed 11 to 12 mile pipeline out there, although they've only secured to this point a little less than 15% of the easements necessary. They're getting some pushback from some landowners, whether or not they ultimately choose to exercise eminent domain, I suppose will be seen. But I think it's important for your listeners to understand that this 11 to 12 mile pipeline in Vigo and Vermilion County is only the beginning. We have BP, the refinery up in Whiting, who is currently in Benton County, looking to develop storage wells down there and run a pipeline from Whiting all the way down to Benton County. We now know of Tenaska working in Warren County. Who they're working with, we don't know, but there's plans for pipelines in Warren County. There's a one carbon partnership in Randolph County that's looking to get storage wells as well. There's projects in Mitchell, Indiana. There's projects down in Mount Vernon. And if you look in Illinois, Iowa, the Dakotas, and other places, there are thousands of miles of proposed CO2 pipelines throughout the Midwest, including Indiana. And people need to sort of get informed and understand what's going on. And it is directly connected to the idea that we need to continue to emit CO2. It's directly connected to fossil fuels, primarily the oil industry, but also the gas and coal industry as well. The idea that Wabash Valley Resources is going to be reducing CO2 emissions from their project is absurd on its face, because they are creating a new source of CO2 solely so that they can capture it and bury that CO2. And why are they doing that? Because of the ridiculous Section 45Q tax credit in state code, that in federal code, that give these people $85 per ton for sequestering CO2. And if you do the math on Wabash Valley, which also matches the math for BP's proposal, that is $1.7 billion in tax credits over the course of 12 years, just from burying that CO2. That doesn't include any of the other earnings or profits or revenues that they may realize from the project itself. That's just, so what we've done is we've monetized CO2 and CO2 sequestration. We've commodified it. We've made it incredibly valuable. And the Inflationary Reduction Act is a lot in the IRA we like a lot. There's a lot in the IRA we don't like. And what we didn't like was this huge expansion of that Section 45Q tax credit, which was largely at the behest of big oil. Not only did it expand to $85 per ton, but it also allows the owners of those tax credits, if they want to monetize those by selling them to third parties, effectively like carbon credits. So there are people who stand to make a whole lot of money creating CO2 and burying that CO2 for the long term in our communities. And we're still trying to understand what exactly are the benefits to those communities who are being forced to host these pipelines and host these storage wells. We don't get it. And those folks out there in Vigo, Vermilion County don't get it either. You're asking us to assume all of the risk and all the dangers associated with these pipelines and with these storage wells. You guys are walking away, the businesses are walking away with a truckload of cash, and homeowners are being compensated a pittance in comparison to what these folks are walking away with. So we're failing to understand. Yeah.
Yeah. So when you say landowners being compensated, you're talking about the purchase of easements. Is that right?
The purchase of easements. I'm also in this case, I'm talking about the storage wells with respect to Wabash Valley Resources, where the compensation rate is really, really low. There were people who were doing calculations for their land based on their understanding of the compensation, and there are folks out there looking at a couple $100 a year. You know, dinner out with your family.
Right. And now that compensation is for being on the land in the, say, 2-mile area that they're talking about, where the carbon sequestration will store the
correct
carbon.
And that's on an annual basis.
We don't know if it's only 2 miles, though.
Correct. The law says, and this is where this is specific, again, only to Wabash Valley Resources. The law says that upon the expected migration of the CO2 to your property, meaning it's already been injected. So that's what I mean when they have the right to condemn. They don't have to notify somebody that, hey, in 5 years, there might be some CO2 under your house. The law says upon the expected migration based on their computer modeling and monitoring. So, they are saying they will monitor and follow that plume over time. And when they believe it's about to encroach on your property, they'll let you know. There's something in code that says this is what they have to offer you. If that homeowner doesn't like that offer, they can go to mediation. If they don't like the outcome of that mediation, they can go to court. We all know how that stuff generally works. So that's what I mean by condemn. Just
triggered by them telling you
correct.
That it might be migrating onto your property now.
Correct. So it says upon the expected migration, but it doesn't say like a week before the expected migration, a month, a year. Doesn't say when they have to tell you.
Dang. So, okay, one more little technical question about the pipeline. So, is the pipeline pressurized at all?
Yes, they have to highly pressurize that CO2 into what's called a supercritical state, somewhere around 2000, 2100 psi, highly pressurized, going into this
Before it even
pipeline.
gets to the injection site.
Correct. According to the schematics that they have shown for their plant, they are going to compress it on site at the plant in West Terre Haute and put this highly pressurized supercritical CO2 into that pipeline, traveling at 2000, 2100 psi or so, that whole 11, 12 miles.
Yeah. So, which in my mind creates, risk of rupture. I mean, that's
huge.
really,
Yes.
I mean,
that's pretty high pressure.
Right.
And this stuff is really corrosive.
Right. It is corrosive, really. CO2 is, really? The carbon's corrosive on metal, steel?
Yeah, they've got to use carbon steel and some lining. I've talked to some folks involved in oil and gas and pipelines and some geologists, and they're like, yeah, it's pretty corrosive. You've got to have special piping. Sometimes they put additives in the pipeline, the additional coatings and whatnot. So there's lots of concerns from the chemical engineers that I've spoken with. They're like, over time, this supercritical CO2 is very corrosive and could erode the casings and the joints and all of that stuff, and the structures going down. We've got these long pipes with casing going into our aquifers with this pretty corrosive material that over time that's what we don't know. We simply don't have the data to say when is this safe? When do we clear it safe? 5 years, 10 years, 15, 20, 50? Or are we dealing with sort of a radioactive waste from nuclear power plants where in perpetuity this stuff is fairly hazardous? So we just don't know enough yet.
Okay. Yeah. I so appreciate this, Kerwin. You're so great. You know so much, and this is so important. So what happens if the carbon emissions that are sequestered go into these, high injunction or high powered, whatever. So critical, when you say critical, that means highly pressurized, right?
Yeah, supercritical. There was somebody at the EPA hearing in Terre Haute that really explained it well. A supercritical state means it has the form of a liquid and a gas. Pressurized, so it has this supercritical state, and CO2 wants to be a gas. So you have this gas sort of fighting with you because it wants to be a gas, but you've got it so pressurized that it's this sort of supercritical that has properties of liquids, have property of gas, and it's just an unstable compound, if you will, based on my conversations with those in the know. So,
all right, great. So, so thank you. So then it gets to the injection site, and then it goes down, whatever, about a mile, and then we don't know. It goes somewhere. Right. It goes through. I mean, this is not like terribly complicated. I think most people understand that geology is it's full of all kinds of different rocks and fissures and cracks and limestone with all the pores through it. All these things, and many of those things that are used to filter water. So it goes through all these different things as rain goes through the ground, it sinks down, it gets filtered by many of these movements through cracks and pores and everything, and ends up in the aquifer. So from which, of course, many people draw their drinking water. So particularly, I think, in these more remote rural areas, I live up by Lake Michigan. We get our water from Lake Michigan, but South Bend they have a big well and a big aquifer that they use. So what happens to the aquifer if the carbon emissions that are sequestered go under, go through the high injection, end up a mile underneath, and then somehow, kind of sneak into aquifers? What happens to the water?
Well, again, not a chemist, but I've been told that's called carbonic acid. When you mix CO2 with water, you get carbonic acid, calcification of that water, and other impurities. So we would have poisoned water, effectively. That would have to be potentially, cleaned up. But the idea, of all of this geological stuff is that we inject it, and the Wabash Valley guys say, well, it's our job to keep it at least 2,000 feet below the ground. So the idea is you inject it into a geological formation that has a cap rock on top that will allegedly sort of seal that CO2 for all time. But as you know, there are fractures, there are fissures, there are all kinds of it, in addition to the fact that we're drilling through it. So we're drilling through it with these pipings and these casing and these drill bits and everything. And, initially they were looking at 8,000 feet or below in the Mount Simon formations. We have since found that those are not suitable. So now they're looking at a formation in between 2 and, 5,000-6,000 square feet or down below or so, with a height of, making sure there's a cap rock somewhere around 2,000 feet to keep it below that level. But here's another thing. Not only are we injecting this into a area with a known seismic zone, they have yet to characterize the geology at these injection sites. That's step 2. Should they get these Class 6 permits? They did do a stratigraphic test well and do some core sampling at a different site that showed potential in the 2,000 to 6,000 foot range, whatnot, but they have not actually characterized the geology where they intend to inject. And the EPA tells us that, well, that's the second stage here, that when they're constructing those wells, that's when they do that additional characterization. And just because they get a permit to construct the wells doesn't mean they have permission yet to inject CO2. So
I see.
They're claiming
and that is good to know for people who want to, be involved in the process, to know that, there's a lot of stages to the actual implementation of this plan.
Yeah.
And lots of places to step in and get involved and, and have some influence on the decision.
Yeah, there's a long way to go.
It is frustrating because you feel like, well, we're already giving them a lot of money to get this far. And then we, if we speak out and, and point out some obvious problem with the actual injection, well, then we've just spent all that money for nothing. And,
Right. And that's part of the concern here is the idea that we have these Class 6 permits from the EPA. It's a new permit that was created back in 2010, specific for the underground sequestration of CO2. That was created in 2010. We've only issued 6 Class 6 permits to date. 4 of those permits were for projects that never happened. So 4 of those 6 never even occurred. The other 2 were for the Archer Daniel Midlands project in Decatur, Illinois. The phase 1, the smaller project, was completed. Now they're moving on to the larger phase 2 project. So we've only issued 6 of these things, and 2 of them are only in effect ever. Now, if you go to the EPA website, there are dozens of requests for these Class 6 permits. But here's what's most troubling is the idea that we would potentially issue Class 6 permits to an operator who has yet to characterize that geology, and that is not a permit to inject. That's just a permit to construct. But the issue for us with that is, which they said as much at a meeting, they need those Class 6 permits in order to get their loan guarantee, $1.2 billion loan guarantee from the Department of Energy. So from where we sit, should they get these Class 6 permits, it really isn't even yet about injecting CO2. It's about this outfit getting a $1.2 billion taxpayer loan guarantee. Whether or not they ever inject anything ever, they're going to get a lot of money that's fully backed by the full faith and credit of the American taxpayer.
They get going on the project, they get the loan, and then everything, turns out doesn't work.
Right.
There's a problem. Then they default on the loan, and they're protected. That's the
Cylinder 2.0 potentially. Yep, you got that right.
Yeah. So then the taxpayers, end up, covering that loan, and those people have no liability. So
and the idea,
it doesn't even encourage responsible, planning or
right.
construction or anything,
because they're not
even on the line. They've got no risk.
The public is absorbing all of the risk, whether it's financial, whether it's environmental, whether it's safety, or whether it's public health. All of the risk is on the backs of the public, the community, taxpayers, and these investors. These outfits have effectively zero risk.
Okay, I have another technical question. Okay, so let's say, okay, so the CO2s are injected, high pressurized, go down a mile into whatever they think they're doing. It's capped, but there's a crack in the cap, or there's a way to get around the cap. And so the CO2s, you know, kind of drift into and sneak into other areas, and then ends up in the aquifer from which someone is, drawing their drinking well. So does the CO2 get in the water, and would it like actually come up into your faucet? I know.
Good question. That might exceed my chemistry abilities. I don't know if this is like hydrofracking where you can light your water on fire.
Right, where they were just pushing all that natural gas.
I'm not sure that I'm the right person to answer that question.
Okay,
so,
all right. Because
yeah.
I mean, that is, of course. I mean, what? Yeah, and I don't even know if there was CO2s in your drinking water, like in your glass of water, and it had, I don't know. Isn't that what they put in, like soda? Do they put CO2 in
Yeah,
it?
correct. Right.
So it's like, it's like that gas, right?
Correct. It's my understanding, yeah.
So you would have fizzy water, perhaps.
Perhaps. Understanding that this is CO2 that also there's brine in that pore space, there's other heavy metals perhaps, so we don't know what that supercritical CO2 is moving or pushing out of the way, and what the fate of whatever it's pushing out, where that stuff's going.
Right.
There's concern there's some concern from some chemical engineers I've talked to that all of this brine could eventually find its way up and ruin all of our high quality agricultural topsoil in those areas. The more I talk to people, the more I'm like, this is really, really, really risky stuff we're talking about here.
And so unknown. I mean, so when it's being pushed down into the earth, I don't know what they're saying that it's moving out. What is it displacing? Air? I mean, it's got to displace something, right? I mean,
yeah. Well, they've acknowledged there's brine down there, potentially other things, but it always goes back to the standard industry answer of, well, we'll be monitoring, we'll be modeling, we'll be watching. We've got monitors, and like some of the stuff, you look at those permits, it's once a year that they report back to EPA on certain things. So they always give that sort of response. Well, we'll be monitoring, okay.
Yeah. So even if it's pushing air out of the way, I mean, the air has got to go somewhere. I mean, particularly if you're insisting that this is kind of a closed area, it's capped and it's closed, and I mean, there's something is there, even if it's just air. I mean, and where's the air going to go? I mean,
yeah, it's pushing something out of the way so that it can take its place. Correct.
So, oh man, there's just so many things unknown. So okay, and so we're not really sure about the whole water thing. Okay.
Can I add one thing to all of this?
Absolutely.
Part of the legislative discussion in 2019, we got that bill, at least speaking for CAC, to a place where we dropped our objections because we got a lot of the bad stuff out. We made it this pilot project, and we also knew that it probably wasn't quite good enough for what they needed. But part of that sort of compromise, a big part of that compromise, was a study committee at the State House around all of these questions that we're asking right now. So all of these questions that you're asking, we sort of still have, and we had tried to resolve that by creating this study committee in Senate Enrolled Act 442, and unfortunately, that study committee never happened. So the Indiana General Assembly did not have any sort of study committee or meaningful discussion with geologists, with engineers, with water folks. Everything was behind the scenes. There was no public discourse or public conversation with experts in these fields to talk about, if we're going to pass public policy around this stuff, what are the concerns we should have? What's the information we need to know? Is this even a good idea? We didn't have that conversation. They just moved forward.
The task force was created, but they never met?
It was not created. It was at the Indiana General Assembly. When you want to study committee on something, you put language in a bill that says, encourage the legislative council to assign the following topic committee, study topic to a committee. Generally, those happen when you have a specific sort of major piece of legislation where you say, we're going to talk about this stuff. and it just didn't happen. So the
I see.
Legislative Council is the body that actually has to create that, unless they do some legislative bill directly for a task force. But it was expected. Part of that legislative conversation, and some people voted for that bill, and some people like CAC dropped our objections because it was understood we were going to have this study committee, and the study committee never happened.
I see. And that's a matter of Todd Houston assigning it?
That's a matter of basically yes, but it's also legislative council, leadership from both sides. And their, legislative council has a website about who's on that. But that's generally at the control of the majority. Both Bray and Houston, as well as other Republican leadership, generally calls the shots, as far as what gets assigned and what doesn't. And it was just never assigned. And that's unfortunate, because now we've got 7 or 8 counties, if not more, where there's some sort of activity around whether it's CO2 pipelines or whether it's CO2 storage wells. And the public knows very, very little about what's going on, unless they're directly impacted, like they are in Vigo and Vermilion County, where most folks found out when the EPA announced that they were going to have a hearing over these Class 6 permits that Wabash Valley filed. Most folks out there didn't know anything at all about it. And unfortunately, the EPA scheduled that hearing the day before the public comment period ended. So it was an informational hearing followed by a public hearing. And one would think, especially with this commitment from the new administration around robust community involvement and public acceptance, that they wouldn't be involving the community. And the fact is, they just didn't. They failed this community.
Right. Where's the environmental justice, whole of government environmental justice approach on this one?
Missing action. And we're having the same problem with these hydrogen hubs. We've had conversations with DOE and some others around transparency related to these hydrogen hubs and meaningful community engagement, and that just hasn't occurred. And it's really, really disappointing.
Hydrogen hub is.
Well, the hydrogen hub, there's huge grant funding out there for these hydrogen hubs, where states or a combination of states have applied for massive, massive amounts of money to host one of several hydrogen hubs. The federal government is going to, at some point soon, announce the winners of these hydrogen hubs. And Indiana is part of what's known as the Mach 2 hydrogen hub with Michigan, Illinois, Indiana. And so Northwest Indiana, sort of the center of the universe, if you will, for manufacturing, is a big part of this proposal to get significant funding for this hydrogen hub, which will fund hydrogen projects all throughout the state of Indiana. Where those projects are, what they are, who's involved, we don't have any idea, but there's a good chance that Indiana will be awarded some significant funding for these hydrogen hubs. And there's been little to no community engagement or community involvement at all.
And so a hydrogen hub is a multi-state, it's a location of a place where hydrogen is produced for the benefit of a wider region?
Correct. Hydrogen is generally produced for the benefit of a wider region and end uses and potential off-takers. Correct. So you have to have means of producing it. You've got to have off-takers to take it. So the concept of a hydrogen hub is, we can make it here, we can deliver it here, but it's lots of projects within that hydrogen hub, and we just don't know what they are. And so we could be receiving significant funding for these hydrogen hub projects that.
And we don't know what color hydrogen it is.
Right.
It could, could be
and
green,
we and some advocates. Yeah, CAC and some other advocates had a conversation with folks involved in that hydrogen hub proposal, and they showed us this generic map of the state of Indiana, Illinois, which had these little areas carved out where there's projects, but no specifics. And so it implied to us that these projects had already been sort of predetermined. But yet, if you go back to some of the EJ stuff, the Justice 40 initiatives, that sort of thing, it was the idea there is that communities will be involved before these projects are planned. If communities don't want these projects, they won't be forced to take these projects. Yet the exact opposite, the experience on the ground appears to be the exact opposite of that. And that's concerning, especially for the folks out in Vigo and Vermilion County.
That is just shocking. I mean, given the Justice 40 initiative by the Biden administration, they're requiring like 40% of all of these, new funded projects to be, benefiting underserved communities, and the environmental justice,
Correct.
aspect, that people, like you say, will be involved in the process of what industry is coming to their community, and will be protected from, being the kind of sacrifice zone where, like we are up here in Northwest Indiana, where, the pollution is so bad already that, people are so, beaten down kind of by all this, piling on of new industry and new emissions, and, and then of course the, mistaken emissions and the, unforeseen discharges, all over, and that, people here are, I mean, they're getting kind of numb to it at some point. So,
Yep.
so now this is where, and then that was the whole point of the Justice 40 initiative, was to, to stop this momentum of just piling on in these sacrifice zones, and allowing the community to, hopefully achieve some justice, as to maintaining a healthy environment for them and their families. So, so that is shocking. That it really is scary and shocking, to me.
Yeah.
So
It's really disappointing too. Yeah. Yep.
it is. So, and you had mentioned, I just want to go back for a second about the class 6 permits for these high pressured deep wells, injection wells. So, but were you at the public hearing?
Yes. Yes. Of course.
And
We went
so,
to the
and
public hearing.
I was like, what? I didn't know anything about this. So, like, what happened at the hearing? I mean, was there good information, or, I mean, did a
Well,
lot of people show up?
the
I mean,
hearing, it was packed. It
oh,
was packed,
well, that's good.
and it was almost unanimous opposition. One of the angrier, more frustrated crowds that I had ever experienced. They had a public informational hearing with Q&A for the first hour and a half. The speaker was a little dry, monotone, gave a very sort of generic, I think it was, somebody timed it, said it was 17 minutes. So then there was a little over an hour of questions, some of which were questions, some of which were just people screaming at them. They took a short break, and then they began the public hearing. Just like at the Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission, they can't respond. You're just
Right.
testifying. But they limited right off the bat. They said, well, we've got 30 some or 40 some people that have signed up, so everybody's going to have 90 seconds to testify.
90 seconds. Wow.
So they limited public comment to 90 seconds. But I would also say this was the first public hearing that I ever saw an end time. They said the public hearing will be 7:30 to 9.
Uh-huh.
I've never seen that before. When an agency has a public hearing, my experience has always been the public hearing starts at 6. They never say, and we are done by 8. They accept the comments, generally speaking, from members of the public. The Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission. I go to lots of IURC hearings. They start their hearings at 6. They take the public comment. They even take a short break to make sure that nobody else shows up or whatever the case may be. So not only did the EPA limit public comment to 90 seconds, they also ended the hearing at 9 o'clock, despite the fact that there were some folks there that still had some things to say. So that was, in addition to the disappointment over the lack of, robust community engagement, we had this very strict, that community got, 3 hours with the EPA, and that was it. And we're out of here. And that was the day before the public comment filing period deadline ended. CAC, myself, and a few others asked for an extension publicly at that hearing. We filed for a 60-day extension the next morning. Well, they granted a 10-day extension. So they extended the deadline period an additional 10 days, despite the fact that some county commissioners from Vermilion and Vigo, as well as State Representative Tanya Pfaff and others, requested further time. They completely ignored that, even said, nope, we're not extending the comment period. And so the community had this very, very short, bifurcated timeline to file comments. EPA came out to talk to them only the day before comments were due, and they extended it 10 days after that. So they've gotten very, very little information, and they're upset,
I
to say the
can
least. So
understand. I can understand. All right. Okay. Well, so we're running out of time, but I want to, okay. Now you do have to explain this one other thing. Um, so, so part of Wabash Valley Resources issue is they're seeking modified air permits, and so right? Am I? Let's see, and it's part of the gasification process, I think, right? So let's see. So they're still trying to. Is it that they really just want to do more of this whole gasification and just expand the amount of carbon and other stuff probably that they want to emit in the air? Is
well,
that
I
what's
will say
happening?
we have not reviewed the air permit yet. We intend to do that. This would be a significant modification to the existing air permits that facility has. They have the gasification unit, they have the oxygen plant, they have the gas turbines, they have the diesel generators. So, not having yet fully reviewed that air permit, I think it encompasses all of the emissions related to the entire power block on site. They intend to primarily use petroleum coke from a refinery. So the idea that we're going to be burning pet coke is somehow green is absurd. To see
Yes.
pretty dirty stuff. And
Yes.
that air permit comment period actually closed, but nobody knew about that filing for significant modifications. So there were some local leaders in Vigo and Vermilion County that requested a public hearing on that air permit out there in the community. And IDEM, good for them, they responded. They actually scheduled a public hearing for those modifications to that air permit. I think it's October 2nd, October 3rd. I think we just added it to our website, but it's out there. So
Okay.
there will be a public hearing on the modifications to that air permit in early October. And
Good.
so, this goes back to the point that there's a long way to go here in terms
Right.
of, their Wabash Valley Resources most optimistic scenario is completion by 2026. And you usually can add a number of years to whatever they believe their most optimistic scenario is for finishing it. So the community should just be aware. While it feels like the fix is in, and I understand why people feel like the fix is in because the General Assembly failed this community, did shove legislation through that enables this project, as did the federal government. So it feels like the winds are blowing in the wrong direction, but there's a long process here. Lots of approvals and other things that Wabash Valley Resources is going to need. So folks need to stay engaged, stay informed, make sure they're aware when there are things that are actionable items that they can take action on. There was the EPA hearing. Now we've got an IDEM hearing, and there'll be other hearings and comment periods in the future. So, and we've got a really nice webpage on our website about Wabash Valley Resources that we're updating almost daily as new information just sort of continues to pour in. So
that's great. And I want to emphasize that. And I think because I think that's so important that there is still lots of opportunity for people to get involved and find out more, ask questions first, and and demand some answers.
Yep.
So that make this a much more transparent project. So and I appreciate your pointing that out. And you put that on your website. There's still a lot of permitting that has to be approved. And as you say, you've got a great page on your website about this project. And I encourage everyone to go to your website, which is what is it, Kerwin?
CITACT.org.
CITACT.org.
It was created well before my time, and we've stuck with it. So that's what it is.
Yeah. CITACT.org.
That's it. Yep.
Okay. So good. I get that. Citizen action. Okay. So
Yep.
Short for citizen, short for action, .org, because that's great. And so people can go there and they can find out about these public hearings that are coming up. Is that right?
Yeah, we just posted that up there as well. So yep, and we get a lot of input from the community. So the community played a role sort of in shaping that page as well. So that's nice when you can have a relationship with the folks on the ground. So and they're working hard out there, and they hearing the you really get emotional because you get involved on the human side of it. You hear their stories about their family farms and their properties and their community and the way they all work together, take care of each other. And then, here come these Wall Street investors wanting to exploit that community. It's just heartbreaking.
It
And
is.
so you got to keep your resolve up. You got to keep fighting. And folks need to also understand that every level of government touches this project and this issue, from local county commissioners and county councils, the state reps and state senators, and then federal governments with your congressman, your senator, and the administration. So any opportunity that folks have when they're talking to elected officials or administrative officials at any level of government, they need to raise their concerns and voice their concerns and ask questions, because it's coming to a community near you, based on sort of everything that I'm hearing and seeing, getting multiple emails almost on a daily basis from folks throughout the state, hearing rumors of CO2 pipelines and storage wells. And
right.
so
We just had it up here.
Yeah.
NERC, Northern Indiana Regional Planning Commission has an environmental policy committee. And at that monthly meeting, which is, I think it's always like the second week of the month, I can't remember, but anyway, it meets monthly, and public is welcome to go. But someone mentioned at the last one that BP came to talk about their proposal to build a pipeline to take CO2s away from Whiting, but they didn't say where. I'm like, well, where's it going? Well, they didn't say. So
they intend to pipe it down to Benton County. They want to build a pipeline all the way from Whiting through Lake County, all the way down to Benton County. They've had a couple of town hall meetings in Benton County, and they've got another one coming up mid-September at the Whiting Theater, at the Fowler Theater in Benton County. So that's what they want to do. They want to capture the refinery, build, I think it's a 30 to 40 mile pipeline all the way down to Benton County, run that through all of those communities. Yeah.
So there's Lake County. So we're right at the very top of Lake County, down through Newton County, which is south of Lake County, and then into Benton County.
Right. So that entire area, they want to run a pipeline through to send down and store.
And then they're proposing an injection site in Benton County.
Various injection sites in Benton County, and we're well aware that they have been actively knocking on doors and attempting to negotiate land leases with farmers, and those folks aren't real happy as well. But they're also playing under a different set of rules than Wabash Valley is playing under, so that should be understood.
Wabash Valley, they're not a favored industry, apparently.
Well, BP is certainly favored. They pretty much
they do what they want. Yeah,
but it's a little bizarre how BP got this bill passed for statewide stuff, and Wabash Valley Resources specifically exempted themselves from that and got their own bill. So it's all very confusing. It calls into question Wabash Valley Resources even more, because it's like, how come BP and everybody else is okay with this, and you're the only ones that says we don't like that, we want this? It's a cause for concern. Why did they need those exemptions and exceptions that others didn't? Doesn't make sense to us.
Yeah, that is interesting. Oh gosh. Okay. Anyway, so we're running out of time, but I just want to thank you so much, Kerwin.
Always a pleasure.
I always learn so much when I talk with you, and of course, this is just such important work that you're doing, and I certainly want to make sure that people know what they need to do, to get involved. If you're concerned, go to the website. Lots of great explanation on your website. CITACT.org, and learn more about it, and look for upcoming hearings, and go and ask questions. I certainly have a lot of questions left. So now that's what people need to do.
The more I learn, the more questions I have. So yeah, there's a lot to understand here.
It feels like that. So and you can see this thing, feels like, as you say, it feels like the fix is in. And although I know there are lots of permits out there, you just, the level of momentum is just a little scary. When something gets this kind of momentum, this kind of money behind it, people come out of the woodwork, because they want to make a buck, and now they think they've got something, and and they can push and push and push, and push these things through. And so, of course, it's incumbent upon us to make sure that we understand what's happening and make sure that the process is transparent and make sure we understand the outcomes of all of
Yep.
this.
And we're doing what we can to help those folks out and keep the public informed to the extent that we can. So always appreciate coming on your show.
Absolutely. All right, really terrific. All right. Well, thank you again, Kerwin, so much. And then just one more time, it's citact.org, and go there and find out what you need to know to move forward.
Yep. Great. Thanks.
All right. Thank you.